Welcome. My name is Dimple Roy. I am the Director of Water Management at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I am delighted to welcome you to our one-hour webinar on strengthening natural infrastructure through public policy. I am joining today from the IISD headquarters in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Treaty 1 territory, we are in the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation, where we gratefully acknowledge our water source from Shoal Lake Botty. We offer respect to those who have long lived with and stewarded lands and waters here and across the prairies, and recognize the ongoing leadership of First Nations and Métis communities. With careful consideration and collaboration, we believe natural infrastructure efforts can be an important part of reconciliation and an opportunity to uphold the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This webinar is the third in a series of webinars under the Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions or NIWS initiative from IISD. This is a 5-year effort funded by the BHP Foundation, where we are aiming to scale up the use of natural infrastructure from novel to normal. Through the NIWS initiative, we want natural infrastructure to be well understood, adopted, financed, and enabled by policy. And that brings me to today's topic. In Canada and across the world, public policies are the means by which governments at all levels, from national to local, can put in place ways to regulate, incent, educate, and implement current societal priorities. We at IISD believe that natural infrastructure, or the use of protected, restored, and enhanced natural systems, can address many of our current priorities. We can meet critical water infrastructure needs, we can meet resilience and well-being needs, and we can meet biodiversity goals, amongst others. I am joined today by 3 incredible experts in public policy. Dr. Lydia Olander is currently Director of Nature-Based Resilience at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. She has worked on the intersection of science and policy for 2 decades, supporting decision makers in addressing environmental challenges. Laniel Bateman is Director for Climate Change, Adaptation, and Resilience Policy at Environment and Climate Change Canada, where she has been for a couple of decades now, working on a range of files related to climate change and nature. Guy Greenaway is the Executive Director of the Corvus Center for Conservation Policy. In his 25-year career, he has focused his efforts on public policy for natural infrastructure, land management, municipal conservation policy, amongst other topics. To provide you with a quick overview of the hour ahead, we have 3 main sections. The first section is panelist presentations, and we'll have Lydia kick us off with a formal presentation, followed by Laniel and Guy, who will both provide some perspectives based on their roles. Following this presentation section, I plan on asking the panelists a few questions. And finally, the section that we end with is the Q&A with you, the audience. To engage with our speakers today, I ask that you put your questions in the Q&A section on your screen. If it's directed to a specific speaker, please let me know. When we get to this section, I will curate and attempt to answer as many questions as we can, given the time we have. Without further ado, I welcome Dr. Lydia Olander to present on the White House report on accelerating nature-based solutions for climate progress, thriving nature, equity, and prosperity. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here and talking with all of you. Great topic. All right. You can pull my slides up. Yeah, thank you. All right, you can go ahead to the next slide. So nature has been a critical element of work in this administration in the United States. There have been a number of different activities and policies and programs focused on natural systems. So we have a 30 by 30 goal, as do many other countries. So 30% of our lands and waters should be conserved or protected by 2030. We have a variety of other programs on mature forests, and I am talking today about only one of many of these different pieces around nature that this administration has been leading. Next slide. In April of 2022, the administration, the Biden-Harris administration, put out an executive order on strengthening the nation's forests, communities, and local economies. And in that, they called for a report on nature-based solutions and identifying key opportunities for greater deployment of nature-based solutions across the federal government, including through policy, guidance, and program changes. And I'm also going to touch on a related and parallel effort on guidance on valuation of ecosystem and environmental services and natural assets in federal regulatory decision-making. There's also a new national nature assessment, which I will not talk about today, but it's another one of the many nature-focused efforts on this administration. Next slide. So the work on the national economic statistics has been happening parallel to the work on the nature-based solutions roadmap. So current national economic statistics, which are used to measure gross domestic product in the US economy, they do so in a manner that does not account for the role and value of underlying natural assets such as land, water, minerals, animals, and plants. And without natural capital reflected in national statistics, the US cannot fully track the role of natural capital in driving economic growth or the loss of nature in slowing our economy, which makes it hard for both the public and the private sectors to plan for the future. So a strategy has been developed by a large part of the federal government, 27 different federal departments, agencies that are now building these natural capital accounts for the United States. And that is something that Canada's been working on for a while. So we have now joined the ranks of countries working on building out our natural capital accounts. Next slide, please. The Nature-Based Solutions Roadmap report had a number of different goals, and you can find this report online. So if you want to see more details, please just search it up online. It's easy to find. One of our goals was to provide a common vision of what nature-based solutions are and what they can achieve, to elevate nature-based solutions as a go-to tool in our toolbox for addressing climate change, both the mitigation and the adaptation and resilience building. We wanted to be seen as a tool comparable to renewable energy, seawalls, and electric vehicles, and be part of that toolbox. And having a name for it has helped make that happen. We also wanted to show that we have decades of experience within the federal government and with external partners, and we know enough about nature-based solutions to scale up now, and to give agencies a strategic path to unlock the full potential of nature-based solutions. We also wanted to shine a light on opportunities to implement nature-based solutions in newer areas, given large federal investments in infrastructure and climate change. So these were hazard reduction and infrastructure focus. Next slide, please. So the definition of nature-based solutions used is one that we agreed to as a country with the United Nations and a number of others. Nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, or restore natural or modified ecosystems to address societal challenges, simultaneously providing benefits for people and the environment. We have a very inclusive definition. So this is large landscape scale actions, whether they're watershed restoration or forest management. There's local scale, parcel scale activities like rain gardens and bioswales, and both completely natural and non-structural solutions, as well as hybrid green-gray options that embed nature into infrastructure, like green roofs and some types of living shorelines. Next slide. So we see nature-based solutions as an umbrella term under which a lot of other terms are used. We hear green infrastructure or green stormwater infrastructure, natural climate solutions, natural infrastructure, low impact development, et cetera. So we really see this as like the one term to bring it all together. All these different things are part of it. Next slide, please. There are a number of different examples. Agencies have been doing nature-based solutions for decades. And so we have across different kinds of agencies, or our Commerce Department and Economic Development Administration, our Department of Defense is using nature-based solutions. Next slide. And we also have our Army Corps, our Emergency Management Agency. So lots of different parts of our government have been using nature-based solutions, and there are lots of examples. And there's a nature-based solutions resources guide that shares 30 of these examples across the federal government. Next slide. One of the things has been a focus on nature-based solutions around risk reduction. So that's been a real focus of the discussion lately. is how nature-based solutions can address climate risk and adaptation and resilience to climate change, in addition to all the various other benefits that nature-based solutions provide. So we have a lot of discussion around flood risk, drought risk, fire risk management using nature-based options. Slide. So this resources guide that I mentioned has 30 agency examples, and it is being updated right now, and it will have over 200 agency resources, informational guides, data, tools, technical training, et cetera, in addition to a list of the federal programs that support or can support nature-based solutions. Next slide. The roadmap had 5 strategic areas for action, and I'm going to quickly run through these. They are more details in the report, but I'm going to talk a little bit about implementation over the last year. So what has been achieved and what we're working on, so you can get a sense of how this is moving forward. Next slide. So the first strategic area of action was policy. So we wanted to work on things like benefit cost analysis, permitting, incorporating nature-based alternatives into decision-making, and strengthening nature-based solutions and hazard mitigation. I will talk briefly about a bunch of the stuff happening across the federal family, but also note here that a number of agencies have moved forward with their own policies and integrating nature-based solutions across their agencies. Slide. So one of the things that we've been working on is benefit cost analysis. So benefit cost analysis underpins decision-making on major regulations, programs, and funding across the federal government. At this point, costs and benefits from changes in the environment are not fully accounted for, so we miss the cost of impacts and the opportunities for nature-based solutions in many decisions. There's an effort on modernizing regulatory review that's been underway, and the benefit cost analysis guidances for the federal government have been updated, and part of that process is we added a new guidance on ecosystem services and accounting for these benefits that nature provides. And so that is in the process, going through final review and final updates, but that is happening across, that'll affect decisions across the federal government. Next slide. There's a federal flood risk management standard that applies for all federal funding, requires agencies to avoid floodplain impacts to the extent possible, but it's necessary to minimize those impacts through the use of nature-based solutions. So there's guidance that's been coming out on this, and there'll be a new toolkit online to help decision makers at the local level or at the federal level better understand how nature-based solutions can be used to address flood risk and help support floodplain function. Next slide. Another thing that's happened in the federal government over the last year is there's a EPA Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative. So Environmental Protection Agency has had this Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative, relaunched it last year, really focused on shared learning around green infrastructure. And we asked them to partner with us on the implementation of the nature-based solution roadmap. So to harness this community and grow it across the federal family to help implement a number of the strategic actions that were outlined. And they've become a very active partner and will continue to be moving forward so that there'll be continuity and implementation of the roadmap moving forward. Next slide. The second strategic area for action is funding. Real goal here is to embed nature-based solutions in as many of our notices for funding opportunities as possible. Lots of funding moving through the 2 laws that passed this year, a bipartisan infrastructure law and an Inflation Reduction Act. And we also wanted to try to catalyze private investment where possible. So it's been a big effort to embed nature-based solutions in programs that are moving out the door, and explicitly encouraging nature-based solutions, and where possible, incentivizing nature-based solutions. This has been across Department of Transportation, our Federal Emergency Management Program, our National Ocean Program. So lots of different agencies involved in their federal programs in setting nature-based solutions. Next slide. So one of these is the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities Program, and what's interesting here is on their scoring criteria, their technical evaluation criteria, they actually give points for nature-based solutions projects, and it has really helped to incentivize the growth of those projects in the program. Next slide. Another program that's been rolled out recently is this very large $22 billion program from our Environmental Protection Agency on greenhouse gas reduction. We pushed very hard to make sure that this program has an open door that would allow nature-based solutions. So it's primarily focused on things like solar energy and other decarbonization opportunities. But there's a deliver additional benefits section of this criteria that include a number of different adaptation and resilience related activities that, next slide please, we think could be nature-based, and so provides an opening for leveraging this money through things like green banks and other community lending organizations to leverage federal funding for nature-based solutions. Next slide. Third strategic area for action is federal assets. So this is federal buildings and facilities, but also federal lands and waters. And next slide. The biggest thing here is these climate adaptation plans. Across the federal government, agencies are required to provide these climate adaptation plans to identify climate change impacts that are likely to affect their mission and operations, and to develop a strategic implementation plan to adapt and build resilience for those risks. And nature-based solutions is one of the key tools in the toolbox that is identified, and there's resources to help agencies understand what that looks like. Slide. Our fourth strategic area for action is workforce. And there are really two big things that we've been doing in this space. Next slide, please. For the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative that I mentioned previously continues to do shared learning internally with webinars within the federal agency to build knowledge and share on nature-based solutions. There's also been some funding going out the door to build workforce. So one of these is a Climate Corps program from the Forest Service to build capacity in forest management and use. There's also a NOAA program on coastal systems that also provides workforce around nature-based solutions. Those have not been awarded yet, but that is in process. And next slide. The other area where agencies have been very active is providing technical guidance. So there's lots of work underway to fill gaps and provide technical guidance to support the development and use of nature. So there are, I would say, probably 100 different guides now that have been associated with work across federal agencies. Next slide. And lastly, we focused on evidence and innovation in research. And one piece of this has been engaging with tribal communities and doing shared learning with tribal communities and trying to make sure that we are harnessing as much as possible the expertise and knowledge that they have as we move forward and partner with them in building nature-based solutions across the U.S. And so that's been one piece of this. And we have also identified kind of where our evidence-based resources are and where there may be gaps in some of those resources across the federal government. So there's been work to kind of understand the state of play on that. Next slide. So I am gonna just give a few closing comments given the interest of this webinar about like how this all came to be and how this is being implemented. So as I mentioned, the administration recognizes that nature plays a critical role in addressing climate change, nature loss, and economic opportunity. And there's been growing interest across the federal government, building on the experience. So agencies are very engaged and interested in doing this. There were also a series of webinars working with non-federal partners across the country the year before this report rolled out to get input and ideas about how this is working in different places. And there's also been international momentum with the work on the UN Environmental Assembly on the nature-based solutions definition and the ENACT partnership that was launched at COP last year. So there's just growing momentum around nature-based solutions, which has helped as well. And then in terms of implementation, I've mentioned the use of this existing interagency group and building upon that as a real great resource. There's so much interest across the federal agencies that people are willing to volunteer to help roll out nature-based solutions and expand their use and address issues like permitting challenges, filling gaps in training, et cetera. And so that's been fantastic to see. Let's see. And I think the other thing that's been interesting is the willingness to incorporate this into notices of funding opportunities. Agencies have jumped to do that. That has not been a fight So it's been great just to see in all of these pieces, like it's just an awareness building, incorporating this term and this idea has not been an issue. Once we kind of moved this forward, it's been really great to work across the federal government to do this. I will stop there. I've probably taken more time than I should have.
Thank you so much, Lydia. I will say that this roadmap has been an inspiration and, has been kind of an exciting milestone and a touch point for our team here. So very excited to hear you talk about it. I will save questions till after we've heard from all three speakers. So I'll ask Laniel to turn on your video and present. Laniel is presenting on some of her efforts at Environment and Climate Change Canada, focused primarily on nature and biodiversity. Thanks, Laniel.
All right. Thank you so much, Dimple, for having me here today. And Lydia, it's great to go after you because I think my presentation is going to build on a lot of the topics that you raised as well. So I was interested as I was listening to your presentation to see commonalities between Canada and the US in our approaches. So again, my name is Laniel Bateman. I'm the Director of Adaptation Policy at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Our team has been leading the National Adaptation Strategy for Canada. And I'm joining you today from Ottawa, Ontario, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I have a place in the country where I live near Algonquin Park, and that's where I developed my passion for nature and why I became an environmentalist. So my land acknowledgement is not just where I live and work, but also my passion. And so I do recognize the stewards of the land in giving me the inspiration for my career path. And I'd like to thank IISD for the invitation to present at this webinar. I think we've had great partnerships and so glad to be here to be presenting. So today, I think I'll cover a little bit, as I said, in the Canadian government context. And I think just building on some of the points that Lydia made, I think nature is one of our best allies in the fight against climate change. And we know this, and we know that intuitively nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure make sense. And I think it's just a matter of transitioning our traditional approaches to increasingly recognize and use nature-based solutions as tools and mechanisms. And I think knowing that these approaches can solve our challenges or address our challenges between climate change, between biodiversity, between equity, and other challenges as well. I think these are the kinds of opportunities that we need to be pursuing, because when we look at the scope and the scale of those public policy challenges, when you have a solution that can start to get at all of them, those are the solutions that I think are really important for us to gravitate to. So I'll talk a little bit today just about things that are happening in the Government of Canada context. You'll hear me using natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions interchangeably. And Lydia, I was glad that you talked about terminology, and I'll touch on that a little bit in my presentation. And I work in the adaptation space. So most of the examples that I'll be talking about are on the adaptation and resilience side of things. So just offering a bit of an outline for my presentation, I'll say that there's three key areas that we're working on. One is awareness, one is on policy direction, and three is on action. And generally action tends to mean funding programs. So on the awareness side of things, the Government of Canada has been doing a lot of work with partners like IISD and others who have looked at having webinars and information sessions and trying to raise the profile of climate change adaptation. And I point in particular to work that we did under the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. We had discussions where ministers were convened to talk about nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure. We had a set of webinars, and this was pre-COVID. And so when we had 200 people joining us for a teleconference, video conference, it was like huge numbers to have that many, and recognizing in the pre-COVID time. And we did some formal technical work there. So we did a best practices guide and looked at barriers and opportunities. And building on what Lydia said, one of the things that we found was terminology was a real barrier, that we were using these terms interchangeably. And so what we did was kind of building on the standard definitions under the UN and others, looked at a terminology and definitions framework to map out what are all the terms that we mean in this space. And if we map them out and it's something that the provinces and territories have agreed to under a FedProv Council, then it has a certain status. And so we can legitimize all these terms or show how they can fit and how they can be hybrid solutions, and those kinds of things can help raise the profile and give status and stature to this work, ministers discussing it, technical work, awareness programs and initiatives. And one of the big ones that I'd like to flag that was really important to us was under the Global Commission on Adaptation. It ran from 2008 to 2021. It was a global initiative, and Canada and Mexico co-led a nature-based solutions action track. And it was about accelerating and raising the profile of nature-based solutions. And so this was something that was really important at the global scale, where Canada was offering experiences and lessons learned domestically, but bringing international examples together as well. And so it's just another example of efforts to raise momentum there. Last one I mentioned on the awareness side of things is for those of you as the domestic audience, hope you had a chance to attend Adaptation Futures with us a couple of weeks ago in Montreal, and hosting that in partnership with Oranos. Nature-based solutions were a prominent theme and topic. I hosted a session, so I know it's true, at that event. And so people were talking about it a lot. And I think in particular with Indigenous partners, this is the kind of thinking and solutions that are make sense in the Indigenous worldview. And I think we have a lot to learn. And so I think it's a good example for us to follow. Changing next to policy. So I mentioned that my team is leading the National Adaptation Strategy. So we designed and developed that policy measure for Canada. So it's the first national policy framework for Canada. It's standalone, it's based on adaptation, big 2-year engagement process to design and develop it. And what we hope through that material is, it's not called a roadmap, but in a way it offers a bit of a roadmap on nature-based solutions. So there is a thematic, a system based on that's called natural infrastructure under the strategy. There's 5 systems, and so nature is one of them. And through this strategy, we list different targets and goals and objectives related to nature-based solutions, and using the power of nature to achieve adaptation benefits. So it again recognizes and highlights nature as one of our pillars in our work on climate change adaptation, and then has some metrics for us to work towards in terms of our goals and targets and objectives. And I would also mention too that it has some guiding principles. And so one of them is avoiding maladaptation. And so in this, we're trying to also set policy direction where we say, if we're going to take an action that we don't do harm, that we're trying to make adaptation measures and resilience outcomes, that we don't inadvertently harm nature or inadvertently cause more greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at how we implement some of these things as ways to implement and set the policy direction. And I mentioned again that there were a lot of people who were involved in that process. And so a lot of policy and thought leadership coming from NGOs, from the business industry, from municipalities and municipal organizations, and again, Indigenous partners that were really vital in this. The Assembly of First Nations co-chaired the advisory table that we had for the NAS system on the thriving natural environment. The last one that I'll mention is action. And as I said, sometimes that tends to equate towards funding programs. It's not the only thing. Building again on some of the points that Lydia mentioned in terms of between the policy and the setting out the awareness. We have a green and government strategy in Canada that also embodies adaptation outcomes and nature outcomes. And we've offered technical guidance as well in terms of codes and standards. But when we're talking about action and accelerating work in this space, generally people are hoping that there's a funding program that would be suitable for them to take action and move this into work. And so that's been a great area of collaboration across the federal family. Some major programs, the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund has now got over $4 billion since the fund was initiated in 2018. And it's a large-scale fund, and it's funded some incredible projects. One of the largest urban parks in the world that's in Montreal, it was funded through this. So natural infrastructure was something that was eligible by design through this program. Other ones later was a specific targeted program towards natural infrastructure, again, under Infrastructure Canada, so a $200 million fund dedicated on that. And the one I would mention just on the horizon is a big development or new development in Canada is the Green Municipal Fund. Under the National Adaptation Strategy, the Green Municipal Fund is going to have adaptation as an eligible category now. So there was a $530 million top-up, allowing adaptation to be eligible, and important components as part of it, because it's going to include capacity building and project design elements, as well as a focus on smaller jurisdictions. And so we think that will be important because we'll have those big programs like DMAF or the Natural Infrastructure Fund, and this GMF will also allow us to get at smaller scale projects. So I'll conclude with those as my three policy areas, and I will just mention that when we talk about the horizontality of this, for future directions, we think the work on the global biodiversity framework will be important work ahead to continue to foster these linkages on the connections between nature and adaptation. And so a lot of work and benefit ahead for us on that in that policy space as well. So I'll leave it there and hope that was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laniel. Big fan of the National Adaptation Strategy, and just like the roadmap, it has pulled together so many different elements. Excited to have more of a conversation on it. Our next speaker, Guy Greenaway, is going to provide some perspectives, his responses to the roadmap and some of what our earlier speakers have talked about. Also, Guy, you're our prairie-based speaker, so excited to hear any perspectives that you bring, given the space that we're occupying right now. Thanks. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dimple, and thank you to IISD for the opportunity to come and to speak at this webinar, and to listen at this webinar. I've been listening with great interest to the previous presentation. I wish I'd gone first instead of last. It's a bit of a pressure position, but what I'm going to do is offer some overarching comments about the applicability of what has been contained in that roadmap to Canada. There's going to be some overlap and some interweaving with what Laniel has said, but I'm going to, for the most part, avoid specific descriptions of those because I knew that she would be able to give you much better information about that. So I'll provide some general comments. I'll provide some comments about the adaptability of this strategy in particular to Canada, some specific comments on the 5 recommendation areas that she mentioned, and then some general observations. Time permitting, at some point, Dimple will pop up in the middle of those and tell me that I have to stop. So again, my name is Guy Greenaway. I'm with the Corvus Centre for Conservation Policy. We're based in Calgary, Alberta. Our focus as a not-for-profit charity is to help mobilize policy in support of biodiversity. So just to begin with the limitations of this, I'm going to take a few minutes to describe an incredibly complex and robust strategy that, as Lydia indicated, has many, many layers underneath. So it will be a necessarily skipping across the water kind of assessment. But I'll start by saying I think it's an incredibly useful guide for Canadians. It needs to be taken in the right context, depending on how you might try to apply it. But I think that's a workable thing. That's a challenge, not a barrier. I think that the issue identification in it is really good, really high quality, and identification, almost implicit identification of some of the roadblocks by the way they frame things was done extremely well. I love the articulation of the government role and the potential government role. And again, even though this is American programs, the structure is very much a valuable illustration. And as Laniel pointed out, some of those things are already reflected in what the Canadian federal situation, the Canadian federal government is doing. I liked the approach of I kind of think of it as thumb on the scale versus finger wagging. It's not about heavy-handed policy legislative direction. It's about, in everything that we're doing, we're just trying to put our thumb on the scale a little bit in favor of nature-based solutions, including it in different things that we're doing, making sure it's there as an opportunity. The huge federal funding injection, I think, is very important, has a significant impact. And again, as Laniel said, there's been some initiatives to do that as well in Canada. I think we all face the same basic problem of this low awareness level of natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions. And I like the way that this report got at some of that complexity. And one thing in particular, a heavy reference to all of the non-technical, non-scientific aspects of nature-based solutions that are going to be increasingly important as we try and do this. I recognize the need and the value of having a multi-purpose document that's climate change, nature, equity, prosperity. I recognize the political importance of that and the efficiency part of it. I just sound a word of caution that it's always challenging when we have a number of things that we're trying to do, and we then overlap all of those circles and try and figure the overlap for an increasing number of circles. We get effectively very limited opportunity to, zero in on something. That's not a direct criticism. That's just a concern that I think we have in this space period. Okay, so it's applicability to Canada. What's different? Obviously, it's a different government structure in Canada. And again, this does not mean that it's not applicable, just that we have to think about it differently. Much more power vested in the provinces than are invested in the state, given the government structure. I think that means that a number of people across the country should look at this as a federal illustration, a federal possibility. Some might be looking at it as a provincial illustration, a provincial possibility, some of the very on the ground things. That's going to be different, like I said, all across the country. I think Atlantic Canada is very experienced and very well set up working with the federal government to do on the ground kind of application things. Central Canada, maybe a little bit less so, still very good at that. Where I come from in the prairies, lots of desire to have it just be done by the province, not involve the federal government. And obviously the funding components of that changes everybody's interest in these things. BC kind of more hybrid as well. Territories obviously much more role of the federal government in the specifics of how land is managed, how guidance is provided, especially for, like I said, that on the ground role. And I think that's a critical part. It's very different it's significantly different in the United States, the role that the federal government has in on-the-ground management. So national park service, national forests, Bureau of Land Management, National Wildlife, even Army Corps of Engineers. There's a lot more role of the federal government in providing those kinds of, again, on-the-ground, nature-based kind of solutions. And the last thing I'll mention is the formula funding. We have formula funding in Canada where the federal government provides funding across the country based on a formula for each of the different jurisdictions, the provinces. In the United States, there's much more program-specific formula funding, so it gives a different kind of opportunity to federal government to play a role in that way. Okay. The 5 action areas, the 5 recommendations, again, I just want to start by saying I think it was a really good distillation of these things. Upgrade. There's Dimple already. I'm done my 2 minutes.
You have a couple
Sorry,
more minutes.
Dimple, you're okay. You know what? I'm actually going to switch to general comments. I think just because there was so much talk about the specific policies by Lydia and some of the response based on what Canada is doing from Laniel. I wanted to note. I think the importance of understanding the role of municipalities, the potential role of municipalities. I think that the best delivery agent possibility and have the greatest capacity issues, and that's something that we're always challenged with. Valuation, Robert Costanza, the guru of ecosystem services valuation, he's so adamant about saying valuation is not necessarily monetizing. Monetizing is not necessarily creating a market price. And I think we have to be very careful about valuation in choosing our methodology. Is it just to make a point that nature-based solutions have economic heft? Then that's a slightly looser methodology than if we're trying to cost out a replacement service. Unsurprisingly, since I come from the not-for-profit sector, I think there's a huge opportunity here in the same way that the soft landing immigration system in Canada is well recognized because of that ecosystem of nonprofits around it. The funding for health research is well recognized as being effective because of the ecosystem of not-for-profits around it. I think that's the same opportunity for Canada. One of the things I particularly liked about the report was the emphasis on training and building capacity, technical capacity, other kinds of capacity, because we have a bit of a tendency towards pilotus infinitum. We come up with numerous pilot projects with no real sense of how they're going to land on a landscape that has very little capacity, and that is not accomplished by a single project, a single set of funding. This is a long-term commitment to funding the entities that can provide that training and provide that on a long-term perspective. And the last thing I'll finish up with is in this strategy and in a lot of the stuff we do, because we're trying to incorporate, and I understand this, mobilization of finance and creation of prosperity opportunities, inclusion of the business community, we tend to be moved a little bit towards the building natural infrastructure as opposed to conserving natural infrastructure. It's harder to generate those kinds of business cases for the conservation side, except that conservation is infinitely more efficient, infinitely less cost intensive than the building natural infrastructure approaches. But it sometimes gets underrated in some of our strategies because it doesn't lend itself well to that engage the business community, engage the actions of the people in these communities that we're working with. Okay, I'll finish it there. Are many more things that I would want to say. It's a great report, and I would definitely recommend it to everybody to look at. There's lots of inspiration in there.
Thanks so much, Guy. Maybe at this point, I'll ask all our speakers to turn on your video if that's possible. We'll head into the next couple of sections. So we are running a little bit behind. So I'll try and kind of keep my questions just at a minimum. Lydia, again, amazing roadmap, and you were integral to it. And you touched upon implementation. You touched upon how this is actually going to be implemented. If you have an example that you can hold up to demonstrate how this roadmap is aiming to address, I'm assuming that, well, I know that in the United States, just like in Canada, you have inequity. You have jurisdictions that are far ahead of others, bigger municipalities and others who are kind of adopting and championing natural infrastructure. Can you just, based on your knowledge of the roadmap, talk about some of the tools and resources that are particularly directed at those who are struggling, those who don't have the capacity to kind of run with it?
That's definitely a big challenge. And with all of the funding rolling out across the country right now, it's been a real focus is to try to, what are the mechanisms for helping communities? And I think there are a couple different things. There's some great models being tried in a number of the agencies where they are using regional intermediaries to be technical assistance centers across the country that are interagency to support communities, and also providing intermediary funders. So they get the federal funding and deal with all the reporting issues, and then can give out small grants to communities. And so some of those models are going to be really important for all kinds of things, including nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions is only one of the elements that these communities need. And so I think those mechanisms are really important. And so there's a couple of them that have developed over this year, one for rural communities and then one for more urban communities. And one of the things is trying to work with these partnerships to make sure nature-based solutions is, they know what the resources are, what the funding programs are, how it applies to them. So one of the things that I'm really interested right now is how do we build partnerships with these programs that work with community liaisons across the country to have a problem-oriented approach where we can say, okay, what's your community problems? What are you grappling with? And then show them how nature-based solutions can be tools to help solve some of those problems and how to access those resources. So we want the federal staff that are engaged in these to be able to help them and understand what that looks like, but we also want the communities to be knowledgeable. So trying to use these networks that have been developed as a pathway to working with communities is a key thing, I think, for us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I have so many more questions. Obviously, a much longer conversation is required. Laniel, I heard many of the same ideas from you. I know that the National Adaptation Strategy is already drawing on some of these regional centers, climate, the word is escaping me. Maybe if you can also take an opportunity to highlight some of the resources and some of the kind of knowledge centers that are working particularly well in the context of nature and climate adaptation.
Yeah, I'd be really happy to. And I think if I could build from Guy's point, I think the word ecosystem, it gets to be a pun in this one, but I think it's a really important one, that there is just a stronger web and network of people who are all working in this space. And I think that's really valuable. I think there's more intergovernmental cooperation federally. The National Adaptation Strategy helped with that, but it's also brought communities together in a different way. When we work outside of government and ISD, I'm not saying it just because you're hosting this, Dimple, but you guys have played a really key role in, bringing out tools, doing webinars and raising the profile. And so those kinds of things are, serving to raise the profile overall. And then we have, partners in the not-for-profit sector, Ducks Unlimited, Nature Canada, we have the insurance industries, we have FCM and ICLEI and the municipal side of things, all kind of working in this space. And so I think it's really valuable. And on the climate change adaptation side of things, we also have the regional climate consortia. So the regional climate services organizations, and some of them are responsible for providing climate data, and that could be helpful for planning and policy measures, but some of them are focusing on the adaptation side of things a little more. So Climate Atlantic, Climate West, Oranos are doing that. And so there are also resource groups where you can go to find information. And so in the federal government, we have the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. And so you can call them, an actual person will actually answer the phone and they can help give you information. And they're not an adaptation services, but they can point you to tools and resources. That CCME report I mentioned may be a better inventory of tools and resources. But with those organizations and that network of groups, whether that's the climate services organizations, the regional climate services organizations, and the many not-for-profit think tank and other association type organizations, I really just think the ecosystem on this is really strengthened in Canada. And I think it's getting us a little further along. I think we still have work to do to bring these nature-based solutions, as you say, from novel to normal. But I think it's a key part of the success. So I'm happy to get that question to kind of point to how many people are out there working on this and what some of those resources are. So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Laniel. And Guy, as our prairie champion, I'm curious. So something that we've held up again and again is that many of these programs are incredible, but they often kind of hit east and west of us. Here on the prairies, we're a bit left behind when it comes to funding, capacity, other things. Is there something that you can highlight in the prairie space or from your experience that is just a good example of a prairie policy where where this kind of programming has had beneficial impacts?
I feel like I got a harder question than everybody else. That's a challenging question. I think that there are a number of policies on the prairies. There are a number of initiatives, work in the city of Saskatoon, work in the city of Calgary, a number of the assets, natural assets inventories that have been done across several small municipalities. Like there's a lot of work and a lot of policy direction behind that work that's going on in the prairies. I think your question is a good one, and it speaks to a bigger concern that we're often looking at this whole problem in a scaling way. Like, how can we start with something and make it bigger? And usually our perspective on scaling is we'll take what we're doing and then we'll add the pump to it and just inflate it and make it bigger. And in fact, it's got to be fundamentally different. Something that you can use with a large community does not work with a small community. Things that you're doing with like folks on the prairies have very few policies around coastal erosion. So that doesn't really work for them. And all of those examples and all of those kinds of motivations for people to get involved. Trying to get people concerned about the resilience of communities due to prairie grass fires is not as sexy. It's not as well supported. It's not as well integrated into policies at local and regional levels. So I think what's going to be really important for us moving forward is thinking, how is this different? It's if we're going to do an inventory, for example, in a city and then an inventory in a small town or a rural community, it's not just going to be smaller. It's going to be a very different approach, and we have to get better at figuring out how to do that.
Thank you so much. I will start taking some of these questions. We have some questions trickling in. At least one is specifically for Lydia. So, and maybe I'll read a couple of them out. I think they are primarily directed to you, Lydia, because all of them mention the roadmap, but at least one of them I think will benefit from insights from the others as well. So, question for Lydia, can you please share a few more details on how FEMA is using nature-based solutions to support disaster recovery? Can you recommend any resources we can look for more information? So maybe that's something that you can kind of chew on for a couple of minutes, and I'll read out another one that may have implications for you, but also for the others. Are the indigenous communities you work with supportive of the term nature-based solutions? I've heard that there are indigenous concerns about the commodification of nature that leads to a transactional relationship between humans and nature when using a nature-based framework, and wondering if you've come across this and have any recommendations to address. So maybe that's a question for both Lydia and Laniel at minimum. Of course, Guy, if you have any thoughts on that, but I'll pause there. Lydia, if you want to answer the question on FEMA, and knowing that you're having trouble accessing the chat, maybe what we can offer to do is, if you do have any resources in this space, more details on how FEMA is using nature-based solutions, we can offer to kind of put that in the chat after you have an opportunity, or put that in our follow-up email if we have the opportunity to share something after this webinar.
Yeah, sure. So I think all these resources are on FEMA's website, but they have put out a number of recent guidance documents, and I know they have another one coming about how nature-based solutions can be used for resilience and recovery. And so there are, I think, 2 guides and a third coming. They, as I said, have criteria in their Building Resilience Infrastructure and Communities program that incentivizes use of nature-based solutions, and the recent reports on what those projects are, you can actually search and find the ones with nature-based solutions. You can find examples of those specific brick projects and what they look like. They also have been continuously improving their benefit cost analysis tool to incorporate nature-based solutions and make it easier for applicants to incorporate nature-based solutions and justify them with the benefit cost analysis tool that FEMA uses. So those are a number of things that FEMA's been doing, and all of those resources and tools are available on their website.
The question about indigenous kind of concerns about commodification and the use of nature-based solutions. Laniel, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and happy to list any resources later too. I saw that was a question, so I'll answer that one proactively also. This is a really good question. I think it's an important one, so I'm glad that it was asked. I haven't heard so much a specific objection to the term, but definitely the paradigm that we have, which is nature-based solutions, infers that nature is over there and humans are over here. And the indigenous worldview, nature isn't separate from us. And so this dynamic that says we'll work with these nature-based solutions, well, we are nature. And so this dynamic where we view ourselves as separate is part of the challenge that got us into many of the messes that we're in right now. And so that was really something interesting that came out of the National Adaptation Strategy process, is kind of saying that we need to reframe our relationship with nature so that we don't see ourselves as separate and distinct from it. And we'll try and edit out of notes, harnessing the power of nature. Like, we are nature. And so we have to be careful about that. And so the terminology in places, I haven't heard the objection to it, but the framing of it is inherently kind of an otherness or a dynamic that I think indigenous worldviews are telling us, like, if you see yourself as harming yourself, if you see yourself as harming future generations, if you see yourself as nature as your relatives, then it's a different framing. And so, but on the other hand, conversely, I think Indigenous partners have been some of the strongest champions for these kinds of solutions, because this is what they're talking about when we talk about working in harmony with nature, is recognizing the value of nature, recognizing our relations. And so in a way, these solutions are what they do. Maybe we don't call it the same thing, but it's the way that they have lived on the land for generations without the kind of problems that we've had. So the terminology and the framing can be the problem, but I think these solutions are gravitating more towards the kind of solutions that we need to be going at. So making the distinction between the two, but it's a really important question. So thanks for it.
Thank you, Laniel. We have one more question in the chat that I'll put out there.
Sorry, Dimple.
Yes.
Can I just speak to that one as well?
Absolutely.
I think it's an important question too, and I think it's in my experience transcends all sectors of society interested in nature. This utilitarian question of nature, commodification of nature, it comes up all the time in all areas. And I think the underlying challenge that we're facing is that there's this desire for silver bullet solutions, that nature-based solutions are going to solve everything. They're actually, that framing is intentionally utilitarian. There's lots of other values of nature and there's lots of other considerations of nature, but when we're talking about nature-based solutions, we're intentionally talking about solutions for problems that we have identified. And I think one of the biggest concerns for me in this is what's happened to nature and nature conservation in the context of climate change, where we've sort of done this flip where nature is only valuable if we can somehow adapt to climate change because of it. And many of those mechanisms become very reductionist. Like if it can't play a role in an adaptation strategy, then what's the point of conserving nature? So we have to be very careful, like what is our goal in each one of these things? And this one strategy, this one approach does not address everything that we need.
Thank you, Guy. Great answer as well. There is one more question, but we are running out of time, and I do want to take an opportunity to thank our panelists. I will read out the question. There's a question about any specific collaboration examples between the federal government and lower tier governments that help implement these sorts of roadmaps and kind of actions on a smaller scale. Great question, but as we've run out of time, I want to respect the fact that many people have joined us in their lunch hours or with limited time. So I'll take the opportunity to thank all three of our speakers. It was incredible to have you join us, for you to take the time, prepare and come join us for this conversation. It's a timely and exciting conversation to be happening, to be part of. Thanks also to my colleagues at IISD, Ashley, Emily, Brittany in particular, for putting all of this together. And of course, the audience. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being engaged, putting in your questions in the chat. Of course, this wouldn't work without you. A recording from this webinar will be available. It'll be sent out as a follow-up email in the next couple of days, and you'll be able to see the recording from this webinar and the two before it on our website as well. So thanks again for being here with us. Apologies, as always, for running out of time. It means that we have lots to talk about. Have a good afternoon, everyone.